What does obesogenic environment mean? Well, obesogen or obesogenic, they're just made up words, so they can mean whatever we really want them to. So directly translated, they mean environments that make you fat. So what would be an obesogenic environment? Well, we currently live in an environment, the environment that we're not adapting to very well is obesogenic for the reasons of the food. There's a lot of food around all the time, and because human beings have genetic pre-programming in them that makes them more inclined to overeat rather than undereat, being in an environment that's filled with readily available, readily prepared food that's really tasty and has some addictive properties to it, that's going to be an obesogenic environment to start with. So I could say that we live in an environment currently that's obesogenic, sort of the opposite of when there's a famine and there's no food available. But there are also substances that we are starting to call obesogens. And what these substances do is they disrupt our hormone systems that help determine whether we're in fat releasing or fat storage mode. And these substances can be either in food products, like they can be hormones that are present in milk or eggs, or the way that the certain plant substances and things like that are working because they cause hormonal disruption after we eat them, or they can be in things that aren't like a plant at all or an animal at all, a living thing. They can be in plastics. So one of the things that we're using as an example of an obesogen is we know that estrogens, which is anything that has a feminizing effect on the body, an estrogen is a feminizing hormonal effect. So we might have hormones within our own body, types of estrogens like estrone and estradiol. These are hormones that like a woman would have in her body that promote female type effects on the body. But there can also be things that we take in from our environment, either from plants. Those would be called phytoestrogens, and a good example of that would be soy. And there are also chemicals in containers and things like that, and these also can disrupt our hormonal balance, and in doing so, they can make us more prone to becoming fat. So we are exposed to just a huge number of chemicals now, and not only do we not know what each of these individual chemicals have an effect on humans in general, or some humans in particular, we really don't have a clue when you mix them all together, which is what happens in the body with hormones. You have a hormonal soup that has a finished product, not any specific ingredient. So that hormonal soup, you could say it would be soup like chicken noodle soup. Chicken noodle soup might have chicken in it, and it might have noodles in it. It has broth and carrots and spices. And the end product, you might be able to identify the chicken or the carrot or the noodle, but sometimes it's all pureed all together and you just have an overall taste sensation, but it might have a lot of other things in it. So this soup that we have, this is coming also from the chemicals that we're being exposed to from the environment. Not even chemicals that we're just necessarily eating. Some of them are absorbed through our skin. Some of them are in containers of things that we're using. So these things can promote changes in our weight. And I like to explain to people that we have a lot of similarities to the time in ancient Rome. So at that time, it wasn't an obesogen, but many of the containers had lead in them. And that was making people lose weight because it was making them sick because they were getting lead poisoning. But it was considered to be the best way to make a container. So people were ingesting lead, and over the years, they were able to accumulate enough of it that would have different effects on the body. And lead poisoning is a really good comparison to obesogen, because not everybody who gets lead poisoning has the same kind of symptoms, and not everyone who's exposed to lead gets lead poisoning. Some people are more sensitive than others. But we're able to go back over time and determine who was exposed to lead and what amounts and where it was coming from, because lead is a toxin that's stored in bones. Our bodies like to take things that are toxins, that are poisons to us, and put them in a place where they're not in general circulation. So bones would be a good place, and fat would be a good place. So one of the things that we know are obesogenic is these toxins from our environment. They might get buried in our fat because we have smart fat that's trying to protect our body from these circulating toxins. And so it wraps them up in a layer of insulation where they don't get good blood flow. Just like when people were eating lead in the containers and there was lead lining the pipes of the aqueducts and things like that in Rome, then the bones sequester, hold out of circulation that lead so your body doesn't have to deal with it directly. Now, over time, we can examine bones and see the lead that's in them, but we can't examine fat because that deteriorates very rapidly after death, so it's not going to be around to be studied for very long. But we are able to start to see that right now, and it's a really new way of looking at things, that the fat might be acting to protect you from toxins. And as we're taking in more rubbish, then some of it is slipping through the guard because our body can't identify everything. It's being overwhelmed. And not everybody is exactly the same. Just like with lead, we aren't all going to respond in the same way. And one of the symptoms of how we might be responding to these toxins is that they might be making us be resistant to releasing fat to be available to be burned, because the body says, no, no, you can't have that fat because it's busy right now protecting you from toxins. So once the toxins are in, they need to be held out of circulation so the liver doesn't get overwhelmed too fast. Because if they were released into circulation, the liver would have to break those down and recycle them or excrete them or find a way of getting rid of them. Because you don't have like an internal trash system. You have only trash day, and it only comes and takes a certain amount of trash away. And you just can't keep dumping all your trash on top of that because the liver service doesn't work that way. It works just like a contracted garbage service. It has a finite ability that it is willing to process. And you can't just pay extra or overtime to be able to have your liver work better. And over time, if you stress it, it's going to work even less well. So one of the important obesogens we know is that there's toxins in the environment that we are absorbing or we are eating or ingesting or breathing. We don't know how they work. We don't know how they're interacting with each other. But there's thousands and thousands of them that we are seeing coming up within tissue samples, samples in your hair and your blood and your saliva and all these things. So we know it's there, and you could say, well, it's in a minute amount. And a poison is dose dependent, but a toxin, which could just be a hormonal disruptor, we don't know whether, what the safe or allowable dose is. For example, there's no safe or allowable dose of lead. And the problems that we might have with getting fat or having obesogens from toxins in the environment is it might not be a single substance, but this soup that we are talking about, the interaction of all of them together, that they are attracted to each other and they make, a dynamic Bonnie and Clyde duo, which, by themselves they might not have done very much, but once they're together, they can create a problem. So the scary part about this is that we don't know what they are, so how are we supposed to avoid them? Well, you can kind of keep trying to read about things, but we really don't have the time. No one can tell you the answer to this because they're so new, we haven't been able to look at the effect over any amount of time. So the general safest bet is to try and limit your exposure to general toxins. So eat organic when you can, and generally just be aware that as these chemicals come in, they're processing a lot of times the food with them. So the least processed food you can get, maybe you're starting to minimize these effects. But there isn't really a guarantee, and it isn't really a poison. It's just probably an obesogen. So we know that it isn't going to kill you, but it might very well be promoting you to hoard your fat and keep you stuck in fat storage mode so that it makes it really, really difficult to lose weight.